Welcome back to Ozarks Tonight. Well, with all that has been going on so far in 2020 with the national emergency, it's hard to remember at times that there is a political election coming up here in a couple months where we will either re-elect a president here in the United States or elect a new one. And our political analyst, Dr. Brian Calfano, is joining us today. You know, Brian, this is such unprecedented times that we're living in right now. You know, how does this crisis affect both President Trump for his re-election bid and the presumptive Democratic nominee Joe Biden, as we are now just less than 7 months away until the election?
Yeah, hey John, it's good to see you. A good question. You know, I think it's too early to tell, and that may not be a satisfying answer for a lot of people, but it's true. It is too early to tell. I'm sure there's a lot of people who don't like President Trump who think this coronavirus situation and the slow rollout of a federal response is going to end up hurting Trump at the ballot box in November. But, you know, what happens is there's improvement every day on the part of the federal response. There's growing connectivity between the federal and state governments. And to the extent that the president is able to oversee a decent testing regime, to be able to make sure that there's enough tests around the country to figure out who has COVID-19, who may have had it, and all these sorts of things, to figure out the isolation moving forward, to figure out where we can open up the economy again, all those sorts of things. Assuming the best case scenario for those efforts, President Trump may be in a fairly decent position for re-election in the fall. Of course, that also includes the question mark of what happens with the economy. This is why the president wants to get things up and moving as fast as possible. It will not be the kind of rosy scenario the president wants to paint in his press conferences. There won't be the flip of a switch or the turn of a key and all of a sudden we're back to so-called economic normal. But if there's a noticeable upswing in September and October in terms of GDP, if jobless claims are going down, people are going back to work, if there's a sort of a semblance of some type of normal and people are feeling more secure, that's going to benefit President Trump. But it could easily go the other way. And you could end up having a botched rollout of some of these initiatives. You could end up having governors continue to complain the federal government's not giving them enough of the supplies they need. And even worse for President Trump, if by opening up the economy you see an uptick in cases and an inability of the federal government to get ahead of this for sort of a round 2 of COVID, I think that's a doomsday scenario for the president. But this doesn't mean that Joe Biden has a cakewalk. Where is Biden? You talk about how there hasn't been a lot of focus on this election. That has really hurt Biden in the sense that he is sort of playing third or fourth fiddle in the news cycle to what's been going on with the president, because the president, of course, has to take charge of this crisis, and he's doing so with these daily press conferences. Biden is reduced to doing these digital town halls where he's on social media and essentially taking some questions from people, but this is totally outside of the realm of American political campaigning as we have known it. And so Biden doesn't get the kind of attention that he would have been getting if not for this situation. As the presumptive Democratic nominee, he should be getting a lot more media time, and he's just not. The benefit to Biden, of course, if you're one of those who have been following Biden's career, is you know this situation gives him a chance to regroup, to hone his message, and to make fewer gaffes. Former Vice President Biden is known for being a gaffe machine, if you will. This gives him a chance, this time off, if you will, this time away from the spotlight, gives him the opportunity to hone his message, to pick someone as a vice presidential nominee who can be his attack dog and can do a lot of the sort of going at Trump and Pence as strongly as possible, while Biden can try to look ahead of all of this and talk about a larger vision and plan for America. Those are things that would benefit Biden. But I got to tell you, the longer this goes on and the better President Trump does in this crisis, the more this sort of takes all the oxygen out of Biden's argument that he would be a better alternative in this kind of crisis. President Trump is learning on the job for sure, and this may end up being the key to him getting reelected.
For sure. You know, you always say the incumbent at least has some sort of advantage most of the time anyway, and it seems like Trump being front and center on all this, he's definitely dominating the news cycle as we head toward the summer. And speaking of that, you know, if these social distancing norms remain in place through the summer, you know, we've been used to seeing these gigantic campaign rallies for President Trump in the past, in the last election cycle, and so far in this cycle as well. If social distancing rules are still in place, you might not see those. Of course, Biden hasn't been able to really get out much at all here in the last month at all. In fact, if these norms remain in place right now, does this affect either one of those campaigns in terms of being able to get out and tour the country and hold these big rallies, in Trump's case anyway?
Yeah, I mean, here's where you would think it would hurt the president more, because he is truly energized by these rallies. And it gives him an opportunity to speak even more extemporaneously and off the cuff and really more harshly than even he appears to do with the Washington press corps. So that's something you would think would hurt President Trump a lot. But I also think it hurts Biden, because if you look at where the former vice president does well, is usually when he is excited by a crowd, and there's a big moment, a big event that he has to sort of rise to the occasion to meet. When he is giving these sort of town hall talks on Facebook or whatever other platform he's on, he looks a bit tired. He looks almost as though he's not that engaged. And that's not to say he's not, it's just that's the appearance he gives. It's more of a low energy kind of situation because he's sitting in a room with a camera pointed at him. It's not the same thing as being in front of 10,000 people. It hurts both of their candidacies, but I think in the end it may end up hurting former Vice President Biden more because, again, it's one less opportunity for him to look in command, to really have a shining moment in front of people. And we're just used to seeing politicians campaign in front of people. Taking the air, kind of the oxygen out of in-person campaigning and having all this stuff go digital doesn't help either of these two candidates.
Definitely. And real quickly, before we let you go, let's talk about, we're starting to see some of the general election polls come out. A lot of them do favor former Vice President Biden at this point. Fox News released a poll, I think earlier this week, that showed the race being a toss-up right now. Should you put any stock in these polls right now, or is there just, totally too much that could happen between now and the general?
I used to do polling, and I would say no. I know people like to follow the horse race and that sort of thing, but two items on that. One, people aren't focused that much on the general election. They're worried more about COVID and getting back to work. So what they're giving you in terms of response may not be exactly where things end up. And number two, a national poll is a national poll. We elect the president by the state. So you got to look at what the state polls are saying, and right now it's too early to tell. A lot of those polls are within the margin of error, so they don't tell us anything anyway about who's up and who's down. It will end up being a close race no matter what happens between now and November, John.
No doubt about it. Our Dr. Brian Califano. Brian, thank you so much for coming on the show, and stay safe out there. Hope to see you soon.
You too.
We'll be back with more right after this.